has been said that the whole church was built on a friendship restored over breakfast. Over the past few weeks, we've been going through John 21, and we see there that Jesus restores his friendship with Peter over breakfast. After Peter denies him and betrays him, Jesus restores him, and the whole church is built on this friendship. Today, I want to look at friendship. It's not just some bonus that children have, but it is foundational to the church. And also we'll see in our reading today that it actually is what a nation is built on. Do you remember when you were younger how you used to make friends? I distinctly remember being about 5 years old, and my mum took me to her friend's house, and then that meant that I had to play with that person's kid. And I didn't know this guy, and he was about my age, but he didn't go to my school. And the whole time I was just so worried that he wouldn't have any Barbies to play with, because that was like my biggest worry at 5. But there was one thing that united Paul and I. We loved frozen cocktail sausages. And he had this massive kitchen table, and the tablecloth went right down to the floor. And so we used to crawl underneath the table, we would crawl to the freezer, take out the sausages, and come and eat them in our little fort. That is what friendship is when you're 5, 10 minutes together, and you're best of friends. It's relatively easy. You have school friends, you have friends that you go to after-school clubs with, and then maybe you go to university and you make friends there. And then you've got your cousins, your siblings, and random people that live in your condo. But then you get to adulthood, and you suddenly realize that maybe you don't have that many friends at all. And the people that you went to school with, well, you don't have that much in common anymore. Or maybe you've moved to a new city, and you can't go back to see your old friends. And in the office, you can't crawl under your desk and eat frozen cocktail sausages with your colleagues. How do we make, sustain, and be friends with people? The Bible has loads to say on this topic because God never intended any of us to live in isolation. Not even God lives in isolation. He is perfect community between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so as his creation, made in his image, that's what we are made for. Friendships look different. There are loads of examples in the Bible of all different types of friends. It starts with Adam and Eve. They're like walking friends, like mums that like to go for walks. They're walking friends. They walk with God. Then there are Naomi and Ruth. They're friends because they were family. There's Paul and Barnabas. They're like backpacker friends. They go traveling together. And then there's Jesus. He hangs out with his disciples, but also Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. They like to eat. They like to play video games. No, wait, they weren't invented. No, they don't like to play video games. They like to eat, and they like to hang out together. Today, we're going to look at a different friendship. David and Jonathan. This was a heavily invested friendship. These guys were BFFs. Today, you might feel like you've got great friendships, or you might feel a little bit drained from your friendships, or perhaps you're just a bit lonely and you don't really know where to start, or maybe you've got one good friend and that is enough for you. Some people have FOMO, fear of missing out. Some people have phobia, fear of being invited. We are all different, and our friendships are going to look different. But how do we be the friend that we want to have? Because friendship starts with us. If you've been following Bible in 1 year this week, amazingly, today's passage that we're looking at is the passage in Bible in 1 year, and I didn't even plan that. It's amazing. So all week, you will have been reading the story of the two characters that we're going to look at, so you'll be familiar. If you haven't been following along, let me catch you up. This is what's been going on. We're going to look at Jonathan. And Jonathan is the son of King Saul, who is the king over all of Israel. And Jonathan, as his eldest son, is in line to inherit the throne. And although King Saul starts off really well, he is anointed by God, he is successful in everything that he does, King Saul gets a bit greedy. And he becomes quite disobedient, to the point where God actually regrets making Saul king. And so God removes his anointing from King Saul, removes his blessing from his family, and he decides in his wisdom that someone else will become king. You would think that the person in line to inherit the throne would be a good choice, but God in his wisdom chooses David. And where we're going to read today, this is the aftermath of one of David's most famous scenes. He's just killed the giant, Goliath, and we see that King Saul brings him into the palace, and that's where David and Jonathan first speak. We're going to read from 1 Samuel chapter 18, 1-5. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off his robe he was wearing and he gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. Has anyone ever seen the movie Mean Girls? Yeah, getting some thumbs up. You will be familiar with that lunchtime scene in Mean Girls where the camera pans over the canteen and describes all the different groups of people sitting at the tables. It's like you've got the jocks, you've got the nerds, you've got the band geeks, and every single high school musical? Well, they do it too. Every single high school movie does this stereotype. They all play on it. It's all about groups of teens that look the same, dress the same, and have the same bad attitude problems. When I was in high school, I must admit, I was also in a clique. And the other kids gave us the name the God Squad, because we weren't very cool. And typically we can find that, we're attracted to people that share our experiences, that kind of understand our norms. And so we can find that our friends tend to be really similar to us or look quite like us. The first thing that we learn from friendship from Jonathan is how to start. Jonathan is a prince. He's grown up in a palace. He's in line to inherit the throne. He's the eldest of his brothers. And he's got access to a massive amount of wealth. But he also is a warrior. He goes out onto the battlefield with his father. He is ambitious and he's brilliant at executing plans. And then you've got David. David, by contrast, he's a shepherd. He's the youngest of all his brothers. He would have spent probably most of his time alone on the side of a mountain, surrounded by sheep and wild animals. And he was a musician. He liked to play the harp. One was a prince, the other was a shepherd. One was the oldest, the other was the youngest. One had access to wealth, and the other had access to nothing. If these guys had been in the school canteen, they would have been at opposite ends of the room. And also, David has been marked as the next king, something that Jonathan has been working his whole life towards. So it doesn't really seem like the most likely combination for a friendship. And yet we read in verse 1 and 2 that Jonathan became one in spirit with David. He loved him as himself. And from that day on, Saul kept David with him and didn't let him return home to his family. David had just finished slaying a giant in a one-on-one battle. So he was called before the king to explain himself why he, a shepherd who had no experience, would face this task, and no other warrior in the entire army could face. And so David is explaining what he's done. He's describing his approach to Goliath, and this is what he said in the previous chapter. You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. At this point, Jonathan's ears would have pricked up. Not because he thought David was foolish or inexperienced to think God would protect him, but because this is exactly how Jonathan had approached his battle in the chapter before. Friendship starts when someone says, "What? Me too." They clicked at a level that went deeper than their upbringings and their lifestyle. They were one in spirit because although they looked different on the outside, at their core, they valued, desired, and pursued the same thing. And for this friendship, it was formed on their faith in God and their vision to see his kingdom prosper. If we're taking friendship tips from Jonathan, I'm feeling a little daunted by this task to have some divine connection with my friends. I don't feel that comfortable with being like, hey, anybody want to be one in spirit with me? It doesn't feel that natural. But Jonathan didn't go across the world or go on some big mission to try and find David. He chose David because David was standing in his house. David was already there. As a starting point for friendship, who is around you? Is it the colleague that you share a desk with? Is it someone that's in your family or maybe someone you know at the gym? Proverbs says, a man who has friends must himself be friendly. It's a pretty good tip. If you're struggling to make friends, this place is one of the most friendliest churches I have ever been a part of. And you need to get stuck in. That's where you will make friends. Join a team, join a connect group, because shared experience starts friendship. It cultivates it together. The second thing that we learn from Jonathan about friendship is how to stick. It's found in verse 3. It says, Jonathan made a covenant with David. So culturally, a covenant, this would have been like a binding pact between two parties. And it was presented usually by the most senior or the more powerful party and person in the party to control a situation. And it was quite common practice throughout the Old Testament where agreements were made about what parties could not do to each other. If you think about it like this. A covenant was a bit like a boundary. There were a set of terms in place, and there were consequences if these terms were broken. And typically in the Old Testament, covenants would have been things like, you cannot cross our border because if you do, it gives us permission to attack you. Or you promise to do no harm to us, and we promise to do no harm to you. Covenants were typically in place due to fear. And a covenant that was based on fear was all about the terms, because it had this mentality that there was no trust between the parties. And the mentality was about protection. It was about building walls, and it was about making sure no one came in and took something that wasn't supposed to be theirs. Jonathan makes a covenant in friendship, not fear. And a covenant in friendship, it's the complete opposite. Jonathan was saying, you can have access to everything. He was about having no walls. A covenant in fear means you are loyal to the contract. A covenant in friendship means you are loyal to each other. The type of friendship described here is about loyalty through transparency. That means that through the good, the bad, the ugly, there is trust and there's commitment. People stick. And this is how Jesus describes friendship. In John 15, he says he will share all with his disciples because they are his friends. But I think we want to be wise about who we are transparent with, who we let into that level of our lives. We are to be friendly with everyone, but only friends with a few. I've got a diagram I'd love to show you. This basically maps out the different types of friendships that you could have in your life. If you look at the top, that's you in red, and then this is the mountain of your life. And surrounding it are all the different types of friendships. Now, these are all positive relationships. They're just different. And so you can see right at the back there, there's lots of strangers, people that you don't know. There's randoms. And then here at the front, we've got your acquaintances. So these are maybe people that you kind of know a little bit, or maybe like you know of them. And then the next tier, tier 3, you can see that it's starting to creep up the mountain a little bit. And these people are typically people that maybe they're in a larger friendship group, and if you got left on your own, it'd be a bit awkward. Or your relationship is mostly just like a like on Instagram. And then tier 2, these are your pretty good friends. You guys go for coffee. You have dinner together. They probably make up the bulk of your social circle. You have a good life chat with these guys. And then tier 1, your closest friends. If this was a mountain of Jonathan's life, David would have been right up there next to him. And as you can see, there aren't that many people up at the top. Your closest friends are the people that you call about important things. They are the people that see your best bits and your worst bits. They're your transparent friends. And when I first saw that diagram, I was a bit like, meh, like, I don't really know if that's true. But actually, this is a picture of how Jesus did friendship. We often saw Jesus engaging with huge crowds, but then retreating to the mountaintop to be with his closest friends. I think we all crave that kind of loyalty. If you think about why people get involved in gangs, it can be because they want that like brotherhood, that support. And then kind of one of the most common ways we see this commitment to friendship is in marriage. Do not believe the romantic comedies that tell you you'll be swept off your feet and ride into the sunset, because marriage is so much better than that. Marriage is a covenant friendship. And it says it in Song of Songs, "This is my beloved, and this is my friend." Friendship in marriage is vital. And for some people, their marriage partner will be their one close friend, and that's enough for them, and that's okay. But the richness and the commitment of friendship isn't exclusive to marriage. When David finds out Jonathan dies, spoiler alert, he dies later on, he mourns his friend, and he says this, "I grieve for you. Jonathan, my brother, you were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women." David had loads of romantic relationships, but they were often built out of lust or deceit, and he didn't build them out of friendship. How do we build covenant friendships without being really weird and intense and freaking people out? You don't want to walk around with like a contract in your back pocket. I think it starts with being a little bit open, with being a little bit vulnerable, and with choosing not to FFK. If you don't know what FFK means, it means to pull out of a social event about 10 minutes before it starts. It starts with those weekly breakfasts, with those lunches, because friendship is built over time. And so we can ask questions, we can listen more empathetically, and we can open up more transparently. And we see in the following chapters how Jonathan and David's friendship works out. Jonathan is protecting David from death. He then supports David through a painful situation, and then he encourages him when he doubts his abilities. Jonathan was with David throughout all his achievements, but also his darkest times. He made a promise to be a friend, and he keeps it until he dies. Every effort you put into your friendships is worth it, because true friendship is much more than just making you feel good or helping you out when you need it. But when we stick and commit, there's a primary way that we tap into the joy that we were made for. And then the final thing that we learn from Jonathan about friendship is how to serve. It says in verse 4 and 5, Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing, and he gave it to David, along with his tunic, even his sword, his bow, and his belt. And whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. Okay, recap. Jonathan and David had connected because they shared the same purpose, and they'd become one in spirit. And then they make a covenant out of that. They want to be BFFs forever. And this bit, this is like the handshake, the secret friendship handshake. It seals the deal as Jonathan gives over these gifts to David. And this is a really significant moment because we've seen this happen to David before. It's like deja vu. David standing before royalty receiving these gifts, because in the chapter before, King Saul, Jonathan's dad, had given to David his tunic, his armor, his helmet, and his sword. But David's reaction to those gifts is this: I cannot go in these because I am not used to them. Why did David reject Saul's gifts but accept Jonathan's? Because on the surface, they look the same. Saul presented David with heavy armor, a heavy helmet, and that just kind of represented how Saul operated as king. He relied on weaponry, and his stance was defensive. Jonathan presented David with a tunic, a sword, a belt, and a bow. But the difference was Jonathan gave to David his royal robes. And that changes everything. That was in line with how David would become king and how he would operate as king, because his protection and his reliance wouldn't be on weaponry, but it would be on his faithful friendships and his anointing from God. Jonathan gave to David everything that he had, because by giving the royal robes, Jonathan was giving up his rank, his royal authority, and he was confirming God's chosen king. It says twice in this passage that Jonathan loved David as himself. And so as painful as this must have been for Jonathan, he chooses to seek first God's kingdom and not his own prominence in it. And he doesn't articulate it at this point, but he says to David, "You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you." Jonathan wasn't looking at what he was losing, but he was looking at what his closest friend was gaining. What would our lives look like if we stepped back in order to allow our friends to step forward? What would it be like if our lives were marked by service for our friends? We have this incredible opportunity to model a friendship that's totally different to how the world sometimes sees it. God builds his kingdom through friendship, because by Jonathan giving David his royal robes, David became king and he thrived. And from David's line, his family line, Jesus was born. I bet he didn't think about that when he was given over his sword. And this is a picture of what Jesus has done for us. Just as Jonathan removed his royal robes and gave them to David, so Jesus removes his royal robes and gives them to us. Jesus puts on our identity so we can be like him. You are marked with royalty because of Jesus, and he invites you into friendship with him so that you are empowered and equipped to serve your friends selflessly. Would you like to stand?